Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest edition of Tales from Outer Space, where I take stories from across the internet and read them for your entertainment. This particular story is called Better Than Flipping a Coin, written by Wyrdsmith. The air was tense in the boardroom. Corin and Eleth, a race of fellow humanoids with reptilian scales, stood in front of a holographic display where two worlds slowly rotated in a live, real-time display, labeled simply as Planet 1 and Planet 2. The two very nearly looked identical to the untrained eye, which, for the most of the individuals seated around the long table centered in the room, was the case. In truth, it was only Corin, a respected astroecologist and a xenobiologist, with enough doctorates to justify their exorbitant salary, who could tell them apart without referencing to the legends framing each feed. At the head of the table, wearing garments that not even Corin could have afforded after saving for several local years, sat a gangly prine, whose thin limbs rested lightly on the desk in front of her. She cleared her esophageal nasal passage, and her noise came out in a high whisper, her translator automatically giving her an authoritative matronly tone. "Thank you for your presentation, Dr. Corin. The skill and expertise you put into your work shows, but you have yet to give us your recommendation." The silence continued after she spoke, and the Eleth tensed imperceptibly. Briefly, they were thankful that their lab coat hid their diaphragm, which had contracted instinctively, forcing themselves to take a breath. They gave the assembled executive staff in front of them a slow tilt of their head. "Madam President, members of the board, the planets you see before you meet all of our key metrics for planned development properties. They so closely resemble each other that for the most of our primary statistics, they match to Sigma 4. Our physicists and geologists suspect that they were actually one superplanet that had been split billions." Corin trailed off as they realized that they were beginning to repeat their earlier presentation and quickly finished to move their thought. "That is to say, both should be recommended as for which should be next. To borrow a human phrase, you may as well flip a coin." Madam President Vrelk leaned back in her seat, her frail form dwarfed by the executive chair made from the finest synthetic materials. Had she eyelids and the necessary musculature, her eyes would have long since narrowed as if she were focusing past the Eleth and seeing into the very being, judging their worth. Century Galactic Real Estate Partners does not flip a coin, nor do we guess. We are the #1 terraforming and real estate company in our sector, and we did not do that by being lucky. Corin would have blanched had their circulatory system worked in that manner, but thankfully their scales did not betray their fear. While they had been a respected member of the company for well over a standard decade, Corin had never truly mastered the art of dealing with the company's executives. Their expertise was in data, research, and analysis. Business and capitalism, as much as they were intrinsic components of all their work, were still very much alien concepts to the Eleth. Fortunately, Corin did not have to respond as President Vrelk took their silence for agreement and continued, her tone softened but still firm. "We'll meet again in one standard week. I expect your recommendations at that time." She then stood up, her tall frame towering over every other species in the room, signaling the end of the meeting and its adjournment. As the board members and the executive staff left the room, Corin busied themselves with collecting their secure data chit as their mind raced. Statistically, System 451, as it was internally known, was an anomaly. Not only did it have a singular sun, but it also had a pair of planets sharing an orbit around it in the habitable zone. The odds of two planets finding a perfectly balanced orbit plane around a single star was so infinitesimally small that had they not found it themselves, they would have considered it a matter of science fiction. The astrologists' thoughts continued as they left the meeting room and began a long trek back to their lab, located on the opposite side of the station that served as Century Galactic Real Estate Partners' primary office. The company was actually made up of hundreds of smaller corporations that all united under their parent group to gain better leverage over galactic resources and served as a state for all intents and purposes within the local galactic union. They even had a democratically elected president that served as the company's CEO, who was selected every standard decade. It was the election of the most recent president, Madam President Rock, that stood at the forefront of Corrin's mind as they entered their lab, letting the door seal shut behind them. As the door blissfully isolated them in one place on the station, they felt comfortable. Corrin ran the numbers on the planets through their head one more time. President Rock has been pushing them and their team for higher and higher confidence scores than their analysis, and for the most part, this was an achievable goal. But System 451 was a one-in-a-galaxy chance that it was all but impossible to give a statistical recommendation for. It was simply too similar. The rest of Corrin's team continued their work as Elith passed their workstations on the way to their office, all to the one side of the massive lab. While most of the more delicate and sensitive research was performed in neighboring clean rooms, almost the entirety of the analysis and collaboration was performed in this lab. Corrin originally had been offered an executive suite, probably to keep them close to the board and on a short leash. But they declined, preferring to turn what was essentially a supplies closet into a cozy office that satisfied their primordial instincts. One wall of the office was turned into a monitor where the feeds from System 451 were displayed. A small desk was placed in the middle of the room so an individual could see the monitor while also standing in front of it, though it meant there wasn't much room for Corrin's third favorite pastime, pacing. The rest of the walls were littered with whiteboards, printouts, drawings by Corrin's offspring, and their diplomas, which their direct superior essentially demanded be on display to anyone that entered the office. At least Corrin knew why the company hired them. As Corrin stared at the two planets on the monitor, the office door unsealed behind them, revealing the lab's latest hire, a human named Paul Warwick. In his hands was a steaming mug of Chellam tea, and Corrin silently thanked evolution for humans' level of empathy. They accepted the mug from Paul, who then turned to the monitor to share Corrin's consideration for the planets in front of them both. Initially, Corrin believed Paul was hired through some politically minded diversity initiative. However, after spending a few standard months with the human, they found him to be an excellent addition to the team, with his ingenuity and ability to think outside the box when it came to problems that left some members of Corrin's team stumped for far too long. In particular, it was the human's capacity for instinctively seeing certain patterns in the multitude of datasets and samples that Corrin found most intriguing. So, which one are we going with? Paul's voice broke the silence and derailed the train of thought Corrin's mind had been on, bringing them back into focus on the identical planets slowly spinning on the display. Corrin took a sip before replying primly, "We have a week to formally submit our recommendations along with the data that supports it." Paul frowned. The facial expression was always amusing to the Elith, but they had long since learned to associate it with Paul being in deep thought. The two stared at the planets as the dashboard swapped out metrics every so often, as well as providing a rapid slideshow of planet-side images or key sites of interest. After a few moments, just as Corrin was about to dismiss Paul so that they could get to work on making the justification for one of the planets, the human said, Planet 2. I would go with Planet 2. Corrin tilted her head slightly as they tried to see what Paul saw, but as always, they had to ask why, unable to figure out the human's strange reasoning. "And why Planet 2? I can't find anything statistically significant between the matrices we have, and our equivalent analysis effectively has the available flora and fauna in a deadlock. Despite having split in two billions of years ago, I've never seen a better example of convergent evolution intersecting with planetary genesis. While both are obviously different on a practical level, they may as well be the same planet." Paul shrugged his shoulders. He knew the data as well as Dr. Corrin, having helped prepare quite a bit of it. And while his expertise was primarily in astrobotany, he had enough electives under his belt that he could interpret the other metrics and information on the planets. Despite all of this, he answered Dr. Corrin's question with, "Just a hunch." That made Corrin pause. They had seen a human's hunch at work before, and more often than not, it led to some interesting results. The astroecologist considered the planets once more as Paul's hunch weighed on their mind. Paul had once attempted to describe his hunches as calling them a gut feeling, and how they were likely based on an advantageous evolutionary adaptation. Corin suspected it might have something to do with the human's pattern recognition that often made some seemingly bizarre connections that made no sense at first. While Corin had no definitive scientific proof, they were at least willing to explore their researchers' hunches in the past. Corin glanced briefly between Paul and the monitor as they came into internal decision. After all, they had tried everything else. The next day found Corin and Paul in the virtual environment simulation chamber. The room wasn't very large, but still larger than Corin's office, and was primarily used to allow researchers to visualize planet-side environments in a laboratory setting through holographic imaging. Additional modifications to the room had been made to simulate auditory components as well as fairly close atmospheric conditions, though few utilized the latter feature. Paul adjusted the somewhat hastily constructed brainwave mapping and biometrics device on his head while Dr. Corin was calculating a few final parameters for the initial tests. Admittedly, despite his reservations, Dr. Corin's idea was interesting, if a bit out there. Paul was aware of research and studies that showed how the human mind could process an image in mere milliseconds, forming judgments just as quickly and often before the person who was even aware of it made a decision. But to apply this methodology to his hunches as part of a means for determining which planet would be the center of a multi-trillion credit investment over the following decades seemed like Dr. Corin was grasping at straws. Not that Paul would ever say that to the scientist's face. Corin looked over the last of the script they threw together at the last minute to attempt an experiment that they were still making up as they went along. But Paul didn't need to know that. Instead, they said,
Paul, to reiterate, we're going to place you in a simulated environment with a simple A/B test. At first, the differences will be stark to set a baseline. As we progress, the environments will become more and more similar. Your goal is to simply state which you prefer. I've attempted to minimize the variables as much as possible, while also keeping a wide breadth to avoid overfitting. As well as these environments on worlds that were selected by our company for terraforming, we'll be comparing your selections to the planet's initial evaluation after processing. Paul nodded as he listened to the experiment summary, making sure that he and Dr. Corin weren't forgetting anything after they spent all of yesterday hashing out the details. Hesitating only for a moment, he finally asked, "Isn't that a bit open-ended, leaving me to decide which I prefer without any criteria?" The tablet in Corin's hands signaled that the baseline series was ready to start, and they moved to exit the chamber so as to avoid influencing Paul's decision. Before seating Paul inside, they said, "Yes and no. We don't know anything about your species' ability to utilize your intestinal tract in your decision-making process. As a result, rather than narrowing your focus, I want you to take everything in. Try and unfocus on any single detail and experience as much as you can. Once we find your rhythm for responding to the options, we'll slowly begin to speed up so that you can't, as you put it, second-guess yourself. Let's do the baseline and see how you do." Paul sighed and moved to the center of the room as the door sealed shut behind Dr. Corin. He wasn't expecting to be this kind of ambassador for the human race when his uncle forwarded the application to him from a business contact. But here he was. Overhead, the lighting in the room shifted and the walls, ceiling and floor vanished, replaced by an empty white expanse. A sing-song voice lilted from nowhere, announcing the start of the test. Immediately, Paul was standing in a lush, tropical jungle. While the ferns and foliage around him couldn't actually touch him, the simulation still bent the images in such a way as to make it appear that Paul could run his hands through the leaves of the plants next to him. The air in the room took on a humid feel as the temperature rose and the calls of alien creatures seemed to come from nowhere at once. Paul tried not to focus on any one thing for too long and instead kept his head on a swivel. He spun around slowly, looking everywhere at once. While a direct mental interface would have probably provided a more realistic experience, Dr. Corin wanted to avoid any risk that the simulation might influence Paul's instinctive response. But it was real enough, and Paul had to force himself not to swat at holographic insects the size of his thumb as they flew by. In what seemed like forever, but in reality was only about a minute, the scene suddenly transitioned to a crisp autumn day in a deciduous forest, complete with the sound of the babbling brook nearby.
It was such a dramatic contrast to the jungle from before that Paul experienced a brief bout of vertigo. Thankfully, he caught himself before he attempted to lean against a tree that wasn't actually there. But the cooler air was a welcome change from the previous environment. Now that he'd gone through that first transition, the second went smoother than the first, taking him back to the jungle that he was in before. It was then followed by the autumn forest once more, and then to the white expanse where that same musical voice asked for his preference,
1 or 2.
Paul immediately responded, 2, without hesitation. While he wasn't going to say the bug was the reason for the preference, it definitely played a part. The next options were a snow-covered field and a rocky beach, followed by a sandy desert and a hilly prairie. Stark differences indeed, Paul thought to himself. He pressed on, and over the next half an hour he developed a steady rhythm, soon needing only a few seconds to assess each environment before deciding. In the end, he found himself back in the white expanse as the room's experiment finished, and the room faded back to its normal appearance, with slightly overheating projection equipment visible. Corin entered the room, fascinated by the data that was already being produced by the model that they had developed with the assistance of a neural pruning algorithm. They gave Paul the Eleth equivalent of a smile and asked,
"How are you feeling? I didn't have time to make the transition smoother. I hope they weren't too disorienting."
The researcher turned guinea pig waved off Dr. Corin's concern. "I got used to it pretty quickly. So how's it looking? Anything usable?" Corin didn't share the results with Paul just yet, but instead became more animated as their smile grew.
"Yes, hopefully. At the very least, they're interesting to say the least. You and I might have to publish this experiment later if we can get approval. It might take us the entire week to hammer out the halfway decent proof of concept model, but these initial findings are extremely promising."
Stretching, Paul nodded and resumed his position in the center of the room. "All right, let's get to it then, Dr. Corin," he said. What followed was several days of intense experimentation and testing that left the human drained at the end of each day, and the Eleth ever more enthusiastic. Paul was not privy to the data being collected to avoid contaminating the results, but if he was, he might have begun to understand Dr. Corin's growing zeal as the testing became more and more complicated. It started with simple A/B preference testing, followed by qualitative scales of preference, comfort and hostility, then grouped preference testing, then predicting metrics, then selected based on the metric's description. It was enough to make Paul's head swim, and he made analysis spreadsheets in his spare time for his favorite game for fun. Eventually, the last test was performed, and Corin entered the chamber with the species equivalent of a grin. They could hardly control their ears. They tucked their slate under their arm as they said, "Well done, Paul. That's the last of it. Why don't you take the next couple of days off to rest? You definitely deserve it." Paul nodded, wiping a faint sheen of sweat from his brow as he removed the EEG and biometric scanner from his head. It wasn't from exertion. All he ever did was stand in the center of the room, but after several straight days of doing nothing but testing, he was pushing the limits of what he could mentally endure. "Thanks, Dr. Corin," he replied. "I think I'll do that. Let me know if you need any help compiling the report for the execs." Corin performed the recommended human gesture for approval and patted Paul on the shoulder and said, "That's all right. You just rest up and we'll see you in a couple of days." Paul gave his boss a weary smile and left the chamber, making a beeline for the apartment on the station. Meanwhile, Dr. Corin returned to their office, wiping their wall display clean with a swipe of their hand and immediately bringing up the initial data analysis that they had begun on Paul's results.
"Fascinating,"
was all the Eleth said as they began compiling their report. They did not leave their office until the day that they were to give their recommendation to the board. "Are you certain?" asked Madam President Vrulk, after Dr. Corin presented their findings using the newly developed human gastrointestinal-based prediction algorithm. The rest of the board sat in varying states of bewilderment and disbelief, but all shared the same hedged concern of the new findings. The Eleth's ears shook minutely, a smirk before nodding, saying, "Yes, to Sigma 6. The silence that followed left a hollow place in Dr. Corin's abdomen, but the science was sound. They didn't know how the humans did it, but somehow their evolution on a Deathworld gave them an unprecedented ability to rapidly assess any environment before they were even consciously aware of their surroundings. They glanced back at the display before the board and continued, "To summarize, there is an inverse correlation between a human's desire for a habitat and a planet's evaluation after terraforming. In other words,
The more they feel at home, the more difficult, costly, and unpredictable terraforming becomes. Madam President Vrog, despite her imposing stature and seemingly emotionless nature, seemed to share the Elith's amusement as small ridges formed on her brow. Well then, given this new data, what is your recommendation for the next planet to undergo processing by Century Galactic Real Estate Partners? Dr. Corrin let out a quiet rattle from the back of her throat, reminiscent of a sigh, and spoke confidently. Planet 1. End of story. I would just quickly like to thank the T5 peeps: Dragon Soup, Cold War Boomerwaffen, Severin Cerberus, Red Panda 121, Leslie 517, Bushmaster 177, Caspar Arnold, Cam Maxwell, Sans the Skeleton, Lightjock, Dragzoon WRE, and Lord Azrakal. Thank you very much.